Good afternoon, everyone. This is Aaron Gelb with Conn Maciel Carey. I'd like to welcome everyone to the penultimate installment of our 2018 Employment Law webinar series. We've enjoyed preparing for and presenting the various webinars we've held this past year and hope you all have found them to be informative and helpful in giving you information and resources to take back to your respective workplaces. The final webinar, so there's still one more this year, will take place at 1 p.m. Eastern on December 4th, and will feature an all-star cast of firm attorneys with a crossover between our employment law group and our OSHA team. The presenters will be covering how the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and OSHA both align and diverge. Also, please be sure to keep an eye out for announcements in the month ahead regarding our 2019 employment webinar series. We are in the middle of planning for next year's series. If there are any topics or ideas that you'd love to hear us talk about or you think would be particularly relevant or helpful, please let us know. Reach out to Dan or me or whomever else you've worked with at the firm. Today's webinar is Strategies for Employee Retention, Combating Unconscious Bias in the Workplace. Between lost productivity and recruitment costs, training costs, turnover obviously ends up costing companies millions of dollars every year. So today in the webinar we're going to discuss strategies to help companies recruit, retain, and advance highly performing employees, hopefully to help alleviate the burden in dealing with this turnover cycle and create more stability in your workforce. And then we are also going to address unconscious bias at work. Also, I think it's referred to as implicit bias. It seems to have been popping up a good bit in the news lately. There are some cases that are now starting to talk about this concept as well. So I think this is a particularly timely topic, and hopefully it'll get you all thinking about it as well. So before we jump into it, just a brief review of who we are, the voices that you're hearing, the faceless voices, if you will. Again, as I said, my name is Aaron Gelb. I am co-head of the firm's Chicago office, which opened in the beginning of this year, in January of 2018. I represent employers in all aspects of the employment relationship. I've kind of got my feet in both practice groups here at the firm. I do employment litigation, all manner of employment cases with a pretty deep focus on Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as obviously Title VII and the Age Act. I've tried a number of cases in federal court in front of juries, arbitrations as well, both employment arbitrations and state employment agency hearings. On the other hand, I'm also an OSHA lawyer. I handle the full range of OSHA enforcement actions from federal and state inspections, as well as litigation over contested citations. I'm going to turn it over to Dan to introduce himself, and then we'll get going.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. My name is Dan Deacon, and I'm an associate in Conn Maciel Carey's Washington, D.C. office. And like Aaron, I am involved in both the OSHA practice group and the labor and employment group. In those capacities, I represent employers during inspections and investigations conducted by federal and state OSHA, and I advise and counsel employers in responding to citations, employee safety complaints, and notices of alleged hazards. And on the employment side, I represent and advise employers in all aspects of the employer-employee relationship, such as wage and hour issues and disputes and claims. I also assist employers in drafting handbooks and workplace policies and procedures. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Aaron to go over the agenda, and we'll get into the meat of the presentation.
Thanks, Dan. And I've already, I think, given a brief review of the agenda, and I think we can already pretty much check off the first circle there. We've given you a little bit of background. We'll give you some more background and introduce the topic. As I said, then we'll turn to strategies to combat turnover and increase retention. I'll be talking mostly about that, and then Dan is going to address the concept of unconscious bias. So with that, let's just jump into it. To provide, I think, start with a little bit of context. Obviously, if you look at this slide, just to kind of focus or frame the issue for everybody. When you think about, look at some of the statistics about workforce participation and where people are in their lives economically, since 2000, the number of people living in poverty in this country has risen by approximately 3 million people to 36 million total, or about 12.5% of the population. And during this period of time, and I'm sure everyone has seen it in some form or fashion in the news, that this income gap, for lack of a better term, between those that are perceived as being haves and have-nots has widened. And certainly this is, rest assured, in today's politically charged climate, we're not here to kind of advocate one side or the other, but I think it's certainly something, as an employer, understanding where you are in your community, where you are in your industry, and how does these societal factors play into what you're doing and how your workforce is impacted, because however they're impacted, obviously it impacts you all. So one of the considerations or things to think about is why are your employees working? Why are they in the position that they're in? What is their motivation for doing what they're doing? I think it's obviously fairly simplistic. Most people are working to provide for themselves or their families, but kind of looking a little bit differently, are they working in essence to pay this month's electric bill, or are they working to pay for college for their newborn child? What are their goals and objectives? What are they hoping to get out of the position? And that's consideration, I think, that applies whether they are stocking shelves in a retail store or working in some white collar position. And I think some people talk about employees or workers being a fungible resource. I think looking at it from the other perspective, that there are workers that may look at the employers out there in a similar manner, or the jobs that are out there. In their mind, is one position or one employer all that different from another, such that they want to stay, such that they want to invest in that employer? Is from an employee's perspective, is working for McDonald's that much work different than working for Burger King or for Wendy's? So we'll talk a little bit today about how you all can hopefully become that employer of choice, how you can stand out amongst your competitors, not just for your customers, but for your employees. So looking at the next slide, if you think about I talked earlier about the costs of attrition and how it impacts the company's bottom line. The statistics suggest that an employee can face or incur costs anywhere from $6,000 to $12,000 simply to replace an employee who's earning $16,000 a year. So there's no doubt that turnover is expensive in terms of recruiting costs, training costs. I often focus on the lost productivity, however. If you think about the time that it takes to source applicants, evaluate the ones that come in, whether it's whether you're doing drug testing, whether you're doing some other form of testing, background checks. If you've got positions that you're interviewing for, how many interviews are they doing? How much time are your managers or directors taking to interview each candidate? If you can't fill it during the first wave, you have to go through the whole process again. Is it a position where you're negotiating terms of employment? Then you have to go onboarding and training. And I think for me, this assumes, quote, a neutral employee, just a generic employee. Those costs can be exponentially greater, certainly intangibly, if you're thinking about losing a superstar. What happens if you don't just lose a boss, but a boss who motivates and inspires the people that work for her? What if you lose a coworker who is always covering for others, can fill in whenever someone is absent, is kind of the glue that keeps the team together? When I was preparing for this presentation, I happened to come across a tweet from some, I think, prominent kind of political thinker or commentator who was, it's not a political tweet. He had been in, I think, a Dunkin' Donuts and had tweeted the name of this employee and said, Dunkin' Donuts needs to reward so-and-so because she's provided the greatest customer service I've ever seen. She had a kind word for everybody, every customer in the store, and an encouraging word for every coworker that she was, interacting with during the breakfast rush. So if you have an employee that is that good, that inspires somebody to tweet out to their hundreds of thousands of followers how fantastic the person is, losing that person is I would imagine, a lot more significant than just losing some employee who is less significant or less important. So how do you keep people like that coming to work and remaining in your organization? So I think one of the reasons that employees are likely to leave is that they feel that they are stuck, that they're in a dead-end job. So if you think about that, what is the impact if the employee thinks that their only option is the job that they have? Now, understanding perhaps there are many employees who love what they do. They came to you because that's what they wanted to do, and they're happy to stay there. But how motivated are they going to be if that they think that there's more than that out there, and they don't see a path to get there in their current position? I think if anyone's seen the movie Office Space, if you think about the employee whose office is in the closet and he's ignored and no one talks to him. I mean, we're not going to talk about retaining that employee necessarily, but if someone is in that sort of position, it doesn't really feel like that they are part of the team or they have anything to contribute, you're likely not going to keep them around too terribly long. So I really think that the key there is showing them that there's either a ladder up or a path ahead, one that leads to self-sufficiency, leads to some creating in their mind, that employee's mind, that they have the ability to better their lives or their life and the lives of their family members. So one thing, and you may be having thoughts or wondering at this point, well, that this all sounds well and good, but how do we go about, kind of these are some big issues. What are some tools that are out there to help us? What can we tap into to help achieve these goals? There are, not surprisingly, or maybe it is surprising to some, a number of different organizations and entities out there that recognize this and are trying to help employers and the clients that they serve mutually advance in this way. So, for example, Goodwill Industries has spearheaded an innovative effort designed to strengthen the role that businesses play in addressing these conditions and prospects for lower wage workers. And they've created what is an international network of over 200 community-based agencies that serve people with various workplace disadvantages. So they provide job training, employment services, placement, and I think one thing that's particularly important, post-employment support. I've heard anecdotally stories of employers that attend job fairs, and there are various, in addition to organizations like Goodwill, there are government agencies out there that provide support for employees with disabilities. They help those employees find reasonable accommodations. They may work with the employer to help find accommodations. So it's whatever the resources are that you may use. Just know that there are things out there, and just then becomes a question of where to look and make sure that you or your managers don't hesitate to take advantage of them. And if it isn't a private or quasi-governmental agency, it may well be the government itself. So a good place to start could well be a state unemployment board or similar agency. So in our perspective, and I think that Dan and I, in preparing for the presentation and thinking about the employers that we've worked with, and obviously oftentimes we're brought in when there's an issue, whether it's litigation, whether there's a complaint or an investigation. But obviously we have the benefit of working with employers across industries, across various parts of the country. We represent employers nationally. So we see lots of different issues. And it really comes down to, obviously there are outliers, but one primary consideration or thing, and that is how the company treats the people that work for it. I think on this slide, one of the things that popped into my head as I was preparing for it is it's very similar to this concept of union avoidance for those employers that wish to remain union-free, that most employees don't vote for a union because they were promised more money or better benefits or something along those lines. It usually comes down to shabby treatment, perceived lack of fairness, feeling that their management is not supportive, or feeling that they have no voice or that they're not appreciated. So we're going to run through 5 key strategies that, from our perspective, will help you all combat turnover and attract and retain workers that have what you need to succeed as a company. So the first one, and this seems like I imagine advice that our parents or grandparents or whomever mentored us in our lives told us, and I think it's great advice. First and foremost is just to say thank you. As it indicates, as we wrote on the slide, I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. It's something that a good manager probably does not even have to think about. But I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, as well as working in various cases that I've handled and just conversations with colleagues and friends, that it's certainly something I think that is forgotten all too often. It's important to say it shortly after a task is completed or an objective is reached. But instead of just saying thank you, make it more specific, more direct feedback. So thanks for helping changing the filing system. It really got me out of a hole. It meant I could get my report in on time and leave from my vacation feeling relaxed and relieved. I really appreciate what you've done for me. And the longer you wait to say thank you, the less motivational it can be. And I think this applies equally, whether it's hourly employees or professionals at a major services firm. I remember talking to a friend who worked at one of the big 5 accounting firms who shared frustration with I guess the managing director of their group because they were never recognized even when they did the things that they were supposed to do. So, if it's meeting a big goal, landing a big client, obtaining a great outcome, if that person doesn't hear anything, acknowledging what they've done, certainly that's something that's going to leave them feeling unappreciated and perhaps more receptive when one of the other big 5 accounting firms or whatever the competitor is calls them up and says, hey, we've been watching you, we've heard good things about you, we'd like you to join our team. If that person doesn't really feel like they're part of a team where they are, I think they're much more likely to take that meeting and perhaps be wooed away to the competitor. Step 2, invest in training. It's certainly our perspective, and one that I've gained over 20 years as a management side employment lawyer, that the really smart companies, the ones that are leaders in their field, invest in training their workforce. I had the opportunity to attend an event with a leading management, or I should say leading business professor from a school out east. And it was really interesting. She talked about certain companies that were particularly successful in their space and contrasted, in particularly one in a retail company that contrasted this one company in Europe that was just an incredibly successful retailer. And one of the things that she talked about was that the employees were trained so well that they knew basically everything any potential consumer would want to know about the products that the company sold. And that way, whenever a customer walked up to anybody in the store, they could talk knowledgeably about whatever it was, whether it was toothpaste or laundry detergent, whatever the products were that were sold. So if you provide your employees with that level of training, and for whatever their job is, you can imagine they can not only do their job better, but feel better about doing it. And I think you want your employees to see clearly also how they can move up in the company. Some manufacturing companies, for example, post a skills matrix on a large bulletin board where all employees can see it, and it lists all the machines and tasks required within a specific department, along with each employee's skill level. This, in turn, encourages initiative and cross-training. So instead of having a supervisor instinctively put an employee with certain skills on certain tasks, it's a good idea to make statements along the lines of, we only have careers here. We don't have jobs where you just come in and collect a paycheck. We're looking for men and women who can work with their minds and their hands and have a high aptitude for learning. And it also, you may consider training employees not just for the job that they have, but helping them either gain skills that can move into another position, whether that's training that's provided at the workplace or an opportunity to go to a local vocational center or community college. I talked with the director of human resources for one large company that had a significant contingent of warehouse workers, and she shared how that work was particularly grueling and took its toll physically on employees, such that there was a good bit of turnover and very few people remained in that position past a certain age. And so one of the things this company did was create a path for these employees to move into or either less physical jobs or jobs that were entirely office-based, whether that's customer service, whether that's sales, or what have you. So you can imagine if you've got a superstar in the warehouse, employee who demonstrates great work habits, she's always on time, but perhaps she's concerned about longevity and the physical impact of the job. If she can see a way to stay with the company, she can bring those same habits and work practices into her new position. I think that's a win-win for the company and for the employee. So when you do invest in training, you want to do so wisely. Conduct a comprehensive orientation for new employees. Obviously, you want to get people ready as soon as they come on board, so they really feel that they can contribute right away and be successful from the start. I think if you don't do that right away and the person kind of feels like they're falling behind from the beginning, it's going to be more and more difficult for them to catch up. You also want to provide opportunities for leadership training for all new supervisors. I think particularly, now if you're bringing in an experienced supervisor, somebody who has a long history of managing people, it may be less important to provide that training for them than it would be someone who perhaps has graduated up through the ranks. It's going to be particularly important to train someone if they've always been an hourly employee, but they suddenly move into an entry-level management position, to make sure they understand how to manage the people, particularly to manage the people that they used to work with. But at the same time, you may have some company values or processes or practices or just things that are unique to your workplace that are going to require even the most seasoned manager to receive specialized training. I'm reminded of a case that I tried in federal court involving someone who was a sales manager at a pharmaceutical company who had sought a promotion. He was a sales manager sales rep who wanted to move into a management position. He had served in the military for a number of years in a leadership position in the military and felt that he should just be able to skip the company's management training program because he managed people in the military. He had to be explained to him that managing people in the military is very different than managing people at this company. So even though he had certain skills, there were others that were going to be both specific to the company and specific to the industry that he'd have to learn. In addition, part of this training process, it's wise to develop and implement effective performance review systems that are tied to your training program, and of course offering either no cost or low cost incentives for doing good work. So step 3, with respect to retaining and advancing employees, help your employees look upwards. There are different motivators. It really comes down to, I think for us, there are two of the key motivators are just ambition generally, as well as career advancement. And motivators are more important than ever, even for low-wage workers, when the financial incentives may be few and far between. So if you make career progression and development and training key parts of this low-wage workers' consciousness, that's going to be a positive. To the extent you can publicize any career success stories, like colleagues in leadership roles who came in at the bottom and have worked their way up to a higher paid role, that's going to be particularly powerful. I think if an employee can see that it can happen to them too, it's I don't want to say it necessarily analogize it to the lottery, but if you see someone in the next cube over wins the lottery, that might prompt you to go down and buy a ticket the next day. Same thing with if they hear about someone who came in at a position like theirs or lower, that's going to hopefully inspire them to put in the effort. On the flip side, if people can't see themselves in that position, they may not ever express their desire to move into a position like that or even begin that dialogue. I'm thought about comments that our mayor here in Chicago had made about people who live in certain parts of the city can see downtown, they can see the skyscrapers, but they can never envision themselves actually working in those skyscrapers. So it's a similar concept in that these people might see the corner office or the supervisor's area, but might think that that's nowhere that I can ever get to. So you want to help them see that there is a way to get there. Show them that there's a better future for the employees who are prepared to put in the work. You're never going to be able to motivate low-wage workers who feel that they are stuck in that dead-end position. Now, the next slide, sounds easy, right? It's probably easy for us as attorneys to talk about it, but do what you can to keep workers happy. What are incentives that you can offer or provide for high attendance? Can you offer non-financial incentives such as a voucher? We get a lot of questions about unlimited vacation. I don't know that that's something that I generally recommend, but depending on your industry, depending on your workforce, something like that could be an option. We've highlighted this one company, Globe Manufacturing, which makes apparel for firefighters. Their employees love the ability to choose their start times, and even though more than 80% end up choosing the 6 a.m. start time that they previously have, they feel better about it because they've been given a choice. I've seen that also works with parenting children, but that might be a subject for another webinar. Considering giving your employees paid time off, which can be used for vacation, personal appointments, or illnesses. Typically, you can decide whether to compensate employees at the end of the year for unused time. Flexibility is also a key retention tool for other companies. Open enrollment for USG Corp. Employees of the building materials company can either buy from or sell back to the company up to a week of vacation time, and apparently more than 40% choose to do so. Step 5, focus on intrinsic or non-financial motivators. So if you're unable to increase financial rewards, make sure that all the jobs are rich in some type of intrinsic rewards. And key intrinsic motivators can be a sense of choice, meaningfulness, competence, or progress. So in terms of meaningfulness, make sure that employees get to see the impact of what they do on the business. Try to create some sense of social significance around the work that people are doing. Give them some choice about how they work. If you brand the job well and turn it into a job, into a profession, I think Starbucks baristas are a good example of this. Have some kind of progression badge system so people can feel a sense of progress. I know even, and it may sound silly, but even at the gym I belong to, like someone who's a member for 5 years gets a blue membership card, someone who's in for 10 gets red, and people actually, you see members like looking at each other's cards and comparing what kind of cards they have. It can matter to people. And you may want to give employees input into when to schedule a company's holiday parties. Workers at factories in Pennsylvania and Utah sometimes allow employees to take a day off at the beginning of hunting season. Other companies allow shift swapping so parents can attend a child's school event. Some companies give workers and employees to continue their education on site, either during or after work. Some other ideas could include hosting family events, such as award banquets or scholarship dinners. I'm reminded of one company that's in the food service business that has a big, at their various regional facilities, they'll have a family picnic day, and they'll have kind of like safety competitions and driving competitions and things like that people get to kind of show off their skills and receive recognition for them. Some employers provide tickets for staff and family members to attend cultural events such as theater performances. Another company that sponsors summer art and oceanography camps for the children of their employees who ride to work with their parents and are transported by bus to and away from the camp so they can see where their parents work. These are all just suggestions or ideas to consider. Obviously, there's a whole host of things that you can do in this manner. So one option, again, is as far as these kind of creative ideas, and recognizing it may not be appropriate or fit with every company, but creating some sort of competition, contests where you've got a leaderboard. It's really a great way to motivate employees without money, without significant investment. I think certainly, I know as litigators, probably Dan and I are pretty competitive people. I'm going to guess that many of your employees are as well. I'm sure most of you all are very competitive people. I mean, it's just that's kind of how people like to measure, whether it's against themselves or other people. So you can have a leaderboard and pitch teams against each other in terms of productivity or quality or safety. Obviously, you have to be careful here. If not handled the right way, or if you've got maybe a workforce, your workforce better than we do, maybe they're not the right people to do something like this, because you just certainly don't want the competition to get too heated and become hostile. But you can also have competitions where there is some reward. I've seen employers develop successful programs where I'm thinking of customer service reps for a hotel company where they win Fitbits based on satisfaction scores and feedback that's received from the people whose calls that they're handling. So you can imagine people have with no incentives, versus customer service reps who know if I get a great score on this call, I could be getting a $200 Fitbit. I'm going to guess odds are that you might get better service from that latter employee. So, many companies use the words partnership or teamwork and communication, but it couldn't be further from the truth. Management doesn't always communicate well with downline supervisors, and some don't communicate at all with employees making the product. And in our experience, the companies that succeed in this manner make sure that they understand that when an employee walks in with a problem, that problem is big to that employee, which in turn makes it a priority to the company. And so, here too, I think every company is going to be different or have some unique challenges, but understanding, so we've talked about rewards and incentives, but having different mechanisms or opportunities for people to raise concerns when they have them. Because if it's not addressed, often it can fester, and it can fester into a discrimination complaint that they take to a local, either a federal, state, or local employment agency like EEOC, or it could just turn into them deciding to leave. It may not be right for the culture of every company, but I think having things like open door policies, we see some clients that have these kind of grievance resolution processes, so that are non-union. They have some sort of program whereby I think GE was well known for having what was called the Resolve program. Other employees have guarantees of fair treatment, things like that, where there's a formalized process for the employee to raise a concern. It tells them who to raise it to, how to raise it, and even lays out the different steps along the way. So when they do raise the issue, they know that there's a timeline for it to be resolved. And that timeline helps keep the management side on track as well, to make sure that the issue that has been raised is addressed in a timely manner, so the employee feels like they're being heard. Just some other thoughts as far as how to help retain and advance your employees, and this may sound perhaps silly, and certainly it may not apply to every workplace, but fully training your receptionists. Make sure that they understand how to answer the phones, how to interact with customers, and how to respond to employee needs. I can share my own experience. Is one of the most powerful things when I was looking at changing firms, was the way that I was first greeted when I showed up at this firm. If someone is made to feel valued and needed when they come in, the first time they come in for their interview, they come in for their some sort of testing, as opposed to if they show up and no one knows that they're coming and no one knows where to put them, and they're left to kind of feel like they're waiting in the dentist's waiting room. That's a big difference. So there are different ways to do, in addition to the training the receptionist, obviously, whether it's having things like is something as creative as having popcorn machines or coolers with soft drinks in the reception area. It's just another thing to think about, kind of creatively and outside the box. So this slide, we're really talking about that studies show that the companies utilize these strategies become more profitable with less people doing a better job. One of the studies we looked at suggests that the average number of hours that a person per week increased up to 14%. This Making Work project has helped the company cut worker turnover to the point where each year was the most profitable year the company had ever enjoyed, according to this study. And I think that is all I have to cover, so I'm going to hand it off to Dan to talk about unconscious or implicit bias at work.
All right, thanks, Aaron. So we're going to begin now talking about unconscious bias and how that affects the workplace. And generally, the first bullet on the slide here is what you don't know about implicit bias can hurt you and your company. So what it is it's a form of prejudice that occurs when judgments are partially influenced by gender, race, or other prohibited factors in which you're not consciously aware. The main questions that you're dealing with here in the workplace are, what do you do about this, and how do you address something that you don't even know might be happening? You don't know that it's actually happening. So most people engage in unconscious bias without even realizing it, usually based on societal stereotypes or their own personal experiences. For example, if you're hiring someone because you implicitly have a more favorable association with them, such as they're the same age as you, you may unwittingly be discriminating against others who are different from you. and that can pose a very real legal risk. So there's a number of recommendations that we're going to go over at the end about how you can address unconscious bias in the workplace. But now we're going to get into some of those legal risks and what to look out for. So when we think of bias, we're often thinking in terms of discrimination, and we typically see and hear of cases involving overt biases or explicit acts of discrimination, and that's traditionally defined as disparate treatment cases. However, unconscious bias puts employers at risk of being sued for discrimination as well. Most employers are well aware at this point that they're prohibited by law from treating employees in protected categories differently from other employees. But what they don't know is that the law also prohibits you from making decisions that have a disparate impact on members of a protected class. And this can occur when, despite your best intentions, a seemingly neutral policy or rule proves to adversely affect a certain protected group. So let's take a closer look at the difference between disparate treatment and disparate impact, the two terms that I mentioned on the last slide. So discrimination in the context of employment is going to show itself in one of these two forms, and they're very distinct legal concepts. So disparate treatment is generally intentional employment discrimination. In other words, this is discrimination where an employee treats some employees less favorably than others because of their membership in a protected category: race, sex, religion, color, national origin, or any other protected category under federal or also applicable state and local law. So an employer can be found liable depending on whether or not that particular trait was the actual motivating factor for the decision in question. So the employer's intent to discriminate is the ultimate issue there. On the other hand, disparate impact claims focus on the discriminatory consequences of an employer's actions. So unlike discriminatory intent, the analysis here involves employment practices that are facially neutral in their effect on employees with different traits, but they actually have a more adverse effect or impact on a particular group of employees. So the one defense there is that if the employer can show that the challenged actions are justified because of a business necessity, you may be able to defend a disparate impact claim. Now let's take a look briefly at the Prima facie case for disparate impact claims and how that works. So a plaintiff will be able to establish a Prima facie disparate impact claim by showing that an employer uses a particular employment practice that causes a disparate impact on one of the prohibited bases. So traditionally, the Prima facie case is going to involve some type of statistics showing that one group of people from a protected category are being treated differently than another. So the elements of the disparate impact claim focus primarily on the disparity, right? That's what's being challenged, is that disparity. For instance, a female employee could challenge a strength test as a requirement for a particular position because it tends to screen out the majority of female applicants. The evidence required in that case, the proof of disparity that exists, that's one element, that the disparity was the direct result of a specific employment policy, rule, or procedure, and then you need to show that that policy, rule, or procedure wasn't necessary, and that the employer could have chosen some other method or rule or practice that was less discriminatory but equally effective in meeting the business needs. And that's where we get to this defense. The employment practice is job-related and consistent with business necessity. And the final note there, even if that policy or practice is job-related and consistent with business necessity, the employer may nonetheless be liable if there's an alternative practice that would be equally effective in predicting job performance, but that wouldn't disproportionately exclude a protected group. So even if that policy or procedure is job-related and consistent with business necessity, and we're going to dive into that a little deeper on the next slide, you still need to show that there isn't, or I'm sorry, you as an employer don't need to show, but it's important to keep that in mind, that there's no alternative practice that would be equally effective when you're crafting those policies and considering these issues. So the business necessity defense, this was first recognized in the Supreme Court case of Griggs v. Duke Power, and this is dating back to 1971. And here we're just going to show you how this came about and how it works. So this case, Duke Power Company hired black workers in only one of its 5 departments, and that was the Labor Department. After the 1964 Civil Rights Act forbade segregation in hiring, Duke Power adopted a facially neutral policy requiring applicants for work in the 4 white departments, as it was classified as, to have a high school diploma and satisfactory scores on standard test and an aptitude test. And the result of this was, of these requirements, was black workers were excluded from those 4 other departments at a far greater rate than white employees. So to justify those practices, the Supreme Court required Duke Power to show both business necessity and job relatedness. And the quote that you see there is directly from the opinion. The touchstone is business necessity. So if an employment practice which operates to exclude Negroes cannot be shown to be related to job performance, the practice is prohibited. And since that opinion, obviously this is almost 40 years old, a number of lower court cases following Griggs have required that the challenged practice be essential, not just effective to the defendant's business. So I mentioned statistics, and we only have about 10-15 minutes left, so I don't want to dive too much into statistics and how this all works. But statistical disparity alone is going to be insufficient. And this is a relatively recent case, Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project, Inc. And this was a pretty seminal case because it found that the disparate impact theory of discrimination applied under the Fair Housing Act, but it also, notable at the very bottom of the screen here, you see a caution that a disparate impact claim that relies on a statistical disparity must fail if the plaintiff can't point to a defendant's policy or policies causing that disparity. So up until this case, state and federal courts throughout the country were struggling to deal with cases involving statistical disparity when the primary issue was subjective decision-making, especially in the context of hiring. There were cases all over the country where people in a protected category weren't being hired by predominantly white male supervisors, and the claim was that unconscious bias created a statistical disparity. So how does the court deal with this? It's really difficult for a court to question a hiring decision such as these examples where there's no policy at play and there's no overt evidence of discrimination or disparate treatment. So the courts have recognized that implicit bias does exist, but they're unable to rule out in a lot of those cases other race-neutral factors as the reason for a statistical disparity, and a lot of times those claims fail. So we'll take a look at just a handful of those, and there's some pretty notable ones that have happened recently throughout the country. The first one here being Pippen versus the state of Iowa. There, the employees alleged that 37 departments within the executive branch of the state of Iowa systemically engaged in discretionary merit-based hiring and promotional practice, and they alleged that those practices caused a disparate impact on the basis of race. The plaintiffs here didn't, however, identify any single employment practice or policy that caused that disparate impact. In other words, they were challenging just that decision-making, the hiring decision-making, and claimed that there was bias in that decision-making. So they presented a lot of social science testimony and data collected from the implicit association tests that were given. I believe they had two specific experts that testified to this implicit bias, but the court ultimately found that the mere fact that a discretionary system creates a racial disparity, that alone is not enough to prove that it was the basis for a disparate impact claim. So the court recognized and cautioned about the role of unconscious bias in the work environment, but ultimately found that subjective discretion in decision-making is a very common and reasonable way of doing business, and one that itself doesn't raise any inference of discriminatory conduct. Perhaps a more notable case was the Walmart Stores Inc. versus Dukes case. And this is a Supreme Court case, so the Supreme Court has even weighed in on this issue, and it wasn't too long ago. There, the plaintiff represented 1.5 million female Walmart employees, alleging that Walmart discriminated against women in violation of Title VII. Specifically, the plaintiffs claimed that Walmart knowingly permitted its managers to exercise discretion over things like pay, promotions, and the manner in which that was done, it disproportionately favored male employees. So the plaintiffs didn't, again, like the Pippen case, they didn't focus on a specific policy or practice, and they claimed that disparity was the product of Walmart's, corporate culture that permits bias against women, and it infected that discretionary decision-making. But what happened here was the court did not grant class certification because there were potentially thousands of individual employment decisions made by thousands of different managers, and it would have been too difficult to manage on a class-wide basis. So in spite of the substantial implicit bias and the testimony that was given in this case, the Supreme Court found that the plaintiffs couldn't allege a single common reason for those employment decisions, and that's where it gets tricky. So ultimately, the takeaway from those past couple slides is if you have employment decisions that are being made, there is a risk of implicit bias in those decisions. And there's ways in which you as an employer can address those. How the courts are dealing with it, it certainly is evolving, and it keeps coming up as an issue. So it is something to keep an eye out on. And with that being said, not only have the courts taken notice of implicit bias, but also the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They targeted implicit bias in their 5-year initiative from 2008 to 2013. That was titled Eradicating Racism and Colorism from Employment. And they held a number of public meetings to address this issue, focused specifically on this issue, and ultimately developed a series of goals and objectives to be achieved over that 5-year time frame. The EEOC also tackled implicit bias in guidance on race, and it defined intentional discrimination to include unconscious stereotypes regarding the abilities, traits, or performance of individuals belonging to certain groups. So here's a quote from the guidance that I'm referencing. It was related mostly to Title VII, and that guidance goes on to explain that specifically racially based biased decision-making and treatment, however, are not always conscious. The statute thus covers not only decisions driven by racial animosity, but also decisions infected by stereotyped thinking or other forms of less conscious bias. Ultimately, bias is common and more or less unavoidable. People are often predisposed to being biased against people unlike them, and that doesn't necessarily equate to negativity or disapproval of a protected class, but the unconscious bias does affect our behavior in very subtle and unintentional ways. And this is a problem in the workplace. As you can see, unconscious bias, it has become an issue in the workplace. It's been litigated. The EEOC has taken a position on this, and there is a legal risk. So what can you as an employer do about it? Well, there's a number of things that you can do to address unconscious bias in the workplace. First, some employers are using assessments such as Harvard's implicit associate test. So this is so their leaders can better understand their own biases. But there's considerable debate about the validity of those tests, and it's problematic even from a legal perspective. The results could be perhaps used against a company in a lawsuit as evidence of bias. So there's a number of different avenues that are preferable, and we're going to discuss those in detail on the next few slides here. So the first suggestion and best practice here is you want to focus on admissions, and this relates more to self-awareness. So rather than asking leaders to take one of those assessments, bias assessments, why don't you share data from well-rounded studies that demonstrate the extent to which we might be enabling stereotypes in the workplace and the existence of double standards that are wrongly applied to individuals who don't conform to our preconceived notions. So the key here is to become aware of your own personal biases so we can recognize them and prevent them from permeating in the workplace. So once we become conscious of those biases, we're more likely to be able to recognize and avoid them. It's much more difficult, however, to do that in the moment when we're at the risk or when we're in the moment of making those choices. So creating an environment where people realize their own potential biases is crucial in making them think before they simply act. And this lends itself to workplace culture generally. This is something that's been being discussed a lot now due to the notoriety of the Me Too movement and workplace culture and conscious decision-making. Those are two things that are being emphasized by employers now in their policies and training programs, and developing a strong workplace culture to strengthen employee morale, employee relationships, and conduct. And that applies equally to decision-making. 2, promote self-aware decision-making, and this ties back into the first one. So managers should take note of any immediate knee-jerk reactions or feelings towards candidates or employees. So determine what characteristics of the individual cause that specific reaction. As I mentioned, you're not going to know of implicit bias at any given moment in the workplace. It's not something that you immediately realize. This is something that you have to kind of become self-aware about and think prior to making these decisions. If you do become self-aware, if the managers and supervisors do become self-aware, they should realize when they're experiencing a certain situation where potential bias may come to the surface. For example, if supervisors even dislike a job candidate right away during an interview, they should make note of that. That knee-jerk reaction might serve as a reminder to pause and be a little bit more deliberate and less reflective in that moment. Otherwise, the remainder of the interview might tend to confirm that initial impression. And these are, just interview tips and suggestions. You can write that down immediately. The thought process, if you put it on paper and you read it out loud to yourself, or not out loud, but you read it to yourself on the paper when you're in that interview, and you have a note saying, not a good first impression, the next step to think is why. Why is it? You want to ask yourself why you're feeling that way and what made you feel that way. So you can get rid of that feeling and focus on the elements that are more data-driven. and whether that employee would be a good employee, provide value to the company, whether they would fit in. So again, be careful of those gut feelings and the in-the-moment feelings. Evaluations. This is also under the promoting self-aware decision-making. Evaluations and reviews also have similar risks. So you can, as a supervisor, mitigate evaluation risk by asking yourself if you would give the same feedback if you're evaluating a man and not a woman, or vice versa, or someone that's white as opposed to a person of color. Of course, this introspection has value only when managers are willing to be honest with themselves, right? And they're often more inclined to take a hard look within themselves if they understand the well-documented business benefits that come with having that diverse workforce. So when training supervisors, make sure that point is strongly emphasized, the importance of a diverse workforce and the exchange of ideas. And finally, you can implement some systemic safeguards to address unconscious bias. So first, consider removing unnecessary demographic data from resumes that are passed along to hiring managers or supervisors. Studies show that your applications and resumes without demographic data, typically women, people of color, and individuals of different ancestries are less likely to be screened out during that process. Two, you should also try and use the same interview questions for all candidates. When you use the same questions, you're decreasing the chance that unconscious bias is going to play a role in what is being asked. So take, for example, questions designed to assess whether an individual understands the value of diversity. That shouldn't be addressed only to white men, with the unconscious assumption that they don't. That's just often untrue, but something that might present itself. So you also can, one other suggestion here, and we're coming into the final slide here, is providing decision makers with phrases to describe an applicant, and those should be based on observable behaviors as opposed to certain labels. And what this does is it helps in two ways. It focuses people on behavioral descriptors, and it makes it much less likely that someone's actually going to write down words that suggest bias. So decision makers can pick up on which words apply and then explain their rationale for selecting that word. And this approach not only helps people focus on behavioral descriptors, but it also makes it less likely that they're going to write down words, again, that are suggesting that bias. Finally, you want to have a more diverse team guiding hiring decisions, and this is another suggestion, as opposed to a more monolithic team. The former there is more likely to catch implicit biases or present implicit biases. So these are just a couple suggestions for reducing the inevitable unconscious bias that may be present in the workplace. And it's really just important to keep your eyes, ears, and most importantly, your mind open to help you or your company understand this elusive form of bias. And handling unconscious bias in the workplace, it may be unique to each workplace. There's a variety of different circumstances and factors to consider. So with that being said, there's no one-size-fits-all, but the three suggestions that we have are good ways to help managers and supervisors stop, think, and evaluate before making employment decisions or employment actions. So with that being said, we can take any questions in the chat function, or feel free to follow up with me or Aaron after the webinar. The slides and a recording of the webinar are going to be made available within the next day or so, and will be sent out to all the attendees. And again, as Aaron mentioned at the beginning, of the presentation, please keep an eye out for our announcement for the 2019 Labor and Employment Webinar Series. We'll be doing about one a month, and that'll be announced via email and also on our Employer Defense Report. So if you haven't had a chance to sign up for that, you can go ahead and sign up, and you'll get an announcement as soon as we have that up, probably within the next month.
And like I said, please don't hesitate to let us know, either reaching out directly or when you get the email with the recording and slides. Again, if you have any ideas, suggestions for something that's not been done or but you'd like a deeper dive in, I'm going to be centrally involved in the planning for the webinar, so any thoughts would be welcomed and appreciated.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. And here's our contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, again, please feel free to call us or email us. And with that being said, we are at the end of today's presentation. So thank you for attending, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.